My personal reflection on publication in the Telegraph about Sadiq Khan's desire to arrest Benjamin Netanyahu. Sadiq Khan now speaks with remarkable certainty. He does not merely say that allegations should be examined. He does not say that an international court must determine responsibility. He declares that Netanyahu is a perpetrator of genocide, that he has broken the law, and that people such as him are not welcome in London. Those are not the cautious words of a public official recognizing an unresolved legal controversy. They are the words of someone who has already appointed himself investigator, prosecutor, judge, and moral executioner. Before accepting this performance of certainty, I would like to ask where the same certainty was during Britain's own wars. Britain participated in the invasion of Afghanistan beginning in 2001 and the invasion of Iraq in 2003. Those wars brought immense civilian suffering, displacement, destroyed cities, shattered infrastructure, prolonged instability, and deaths extending far beyond the initial military operations. Where was the Sadiq Khan declaration that Tony Blair was a perpetrator of an international crime? Where was the statement that those responsible for Iraq were unwelcome in London? Where was the demand that British political leaders feel the full weight of public opinion whenever they entered the capital? Where was the effort to attach personal criminal guilt to the leaders whose decisions placed British forces in Iraq and Afghanistan and leaders of military British forces? Khan may answer that the legal circumstances were different. He may point to the ICC warrant concerning Netanyahu, Britain's membership in the Rome Statute, or the claimed jurisdiction of the court over Palestinian territory. But the ICC warrant does not declare Netanyahu guilty of genocide. It concerns allegations of war crimes and crimes against humanity. A warrant is not a conviction, and the word genocide does not become a proven judgment simply because Sadiq Khan repeatedly speaks it as one. That is the central problem. Khan is entitled to criticize Israel. He is entitled to oppose its military policy, question proportionality, demand humanitarian assistance, and express concern for Palestinian civilians. What he should not do is convert an unresolved accusation into an established fact and then use the authority and visibility of his office to pronounce a named person guilty. The contrast is difficult to ignore. When Britain was directly involved in wars that produced enormous civilian suffering, the discussion surrounding responsibility remained politically qualified. There were inquiries, arguments over intelligence, disputes about legality, and years of institutional caution. British leaders continued to speak, travel, receive honors, and remain welcome in public life. But in the case of Israel, Khan appears to require no final judgment, no completed trial, and no proven personal responsibility. An accusation is enough. A contested legal theory becomes a verdict. Netanyahu is not described as a person facing allegations. He is declared to be a perpetrator. This creates the appearance of two moral standards. For British wars, responsibility is complicated. Decisions must be placed in context. Intent is difficult to establish. The chain of causation is debated. Civilian deaths do not automatically prove a crime. For Israel, those safeguards disappear. Khan reaches the conclusion first and treats legal proceedings as secondary. Perhaps he sincerely believes that Gaza is different from Iraq and Afghanistan. But sincerity does not answer the question of consistency. A public official who uses the language of criminal guilt should be expected to apply the same standard regardless of the nationality, religion, or political popularity of the accused. Khan's past opposition to Iraq does not remove this contradiction. In one sense, it makes the contradiction clearer. He understood that Iraq was disastrous. He understood that foreign intervention could devastate civilian life. Yet he apparently did not consider it appropriate to publicly pronounce British leaders guilty of genocide, war crimes, or crimes against humanity without a judicial determination. Why, then, is such restraint unnecessary when the accused is the Prime Minister of Israel? This is not a demand that all leaders be condemned equally without evidence. It is the opposite. It is a demand that accusations of the gravest international crimes be treated with equal care. Either legal guilt requires adjudication, or it does not. Either public officials should distinguish allegations from proven crimes, or they should not. Either civilian suffering triggers the same moral scrutiny regardless of which country caused it, or international justice becomes little more than selective political language. The Telegraph article is therefore not merely about whether Sadiq Khan exceeded the formal powers of the Mayor of London. It raises a more fundamental question about the authority he claims in public discourse. He cannot issue an international judgment. He cannot transform an allegation into a conviction. He cannot make the ICC warrant say genocide when it does not. Most importantly, he should not reserve absolute moral certainty for Israel while treating the consequences of Britain's own wars as matters of history, complexity, and political disagreement. A mayor responsible for community relations should understand the danger of such selective certainty. When Israel is presented not as a state whose conduct may be criticized, but as the uniquely criminal nation whose elected leader may be declared guilty before trial, the distinction between political criticism and collective hostility becomes increasingly difficult to preserve. My questions to Sadiq Khan is therefore simple. You opposed the Iraq War, but where was this language then? Where was the declaration of personal guilt? Where was the exclusion from London? Where was the certainty that no legal judgment was required before naming the perpetrator? And why does that certainty appear only now, when the country under accusation is Israel? Of course, Sadiq Khan cannot personally arrest Tony Blair, but that answer avoids the real question. Khan also cannot personally adjudicate Benjamin Netanyahu's guilt, yet he has no hesitation in declaring him a perpetrator of genocide and announcing that such a man is unwelcome in London. Tony Blair remains free not because the suffering caused by the Iraq War was imaginary, and not because every moral and legal question surrounding the invasion was satisfactorily resolved. He remains free because no institution issued the kind of warrant that the ICC issued against Netanyahu. The Shilkut inquiry concluded that military action was not a last resort, peaceful options had not been exhausted. The process for determining legality was deeply unsatisfactory, and Britain was inadequately prepared for the consequences. Yet Khan does not call Blair a perpetrator. He does not say that Blair has broken international law. He does not announce that Blair should feel the full weight of public condemnation whenever he enters London. Why not? Or unwelcomed in London. Instead, Blair receives complexity, historical context, and institutional restraint. Netanyahu receives certainty, condemnation, and exclusion. The question is not why Khan has failed to perform an arrest he has no power to perform. The question is why his moral outrage becomes absolute only when the accused leader is Israeli. Khan and Mamdani have communicated, and they publicly expressed closely similar views about Netanyahu. But the available evidence does not show that Khan said they discussed this specific issue together or reached a private agreement about Netanyahu's criminality. Their public positions are nevertheless strikingly aligned. Mamdani called Netanyahu a war criminal and the architect of a horrific genocide. Khan called Netanyahu responsible for genocide, a lawbreaker, and someone who should be brought to book. It is troubling when the mayors of two of the Western world's most important cities adopt language about Israel's elected prime minister that closely resembles the language promoted by Israel's armed enemies, such as Iran, Hamas, Hezbollah, Yemen, Islamic Jihad. That resemblance does not prove coordination or shared allegiance, and their Muslim faith is not evidence of either. But it does justify asking why these officials repeat the most severe accusation as an established fact, go beyond the actual charges in the ICC warrant, and apply a degree of personal condemnation that they have not visibly applied to leaders responsible for other destructive wars. Two elected Western mayors have adopted an accusatory narrative also advanced by Israel's enemies, without maintaining the distinction between allegation and judgment, and without demonstrating the same moral certainty toward comparable leaders elsewhere. What explains that selectivity? What struck me most was not only what Sadiq Khan said, but what he chose not to say. He declared Netanyahu a perpetrator of genocide, a lawbreaker, and a man unwelcome in London. Yet in that same exchange, he offered no word of concern for the Israeli civilians slaughtered on October 7th, no mention of the hostages dragged into Gaza, and no acknowledgement that Israel was attacked by an organization whose violence was deliberately directed at civilians. This silence matters. A mayor who claims the authority to speak in the language of universal justice should be capable of recognizing suffering on both sides. He could have condemned Palestinian civilian deaths while also affirming that Israeli civilians have a right to safety and that Hamas bears responsibility for initiating a campaign of mass murder and hostage-taking. Instead, the moral picture was reduced to one accused criminal and one suffering population. Israeli victims disappeared from the story entirely. That omission makes Khan's language appear less like a universal moral principle and more like a selective political judgment. His compassion is expansive when speaking about Gaza, but absent when the victims are Israeli. His certainty is absolute when condemning Netanyahu, but he offers no comparable condemnation of Hamas in the same breath. The issue is not that every sentence about Gaza must contain a complete history of the conflict. The issue is that Khan was making a sweeping moral pronouncement about responsibility, justice, and criminality. In that context, excluding October 7th and the continuing danger to Israeli civilians creates a distorted account of the war. Justice that sees only one group's suffering is not universal justice. It is selective advocacy presented in the language of law.